Well, hello to you all, those who are joining us present here around the Mining Indaba, as we are on the side and rather in the exhibition hall of the Mining Indaba, currently taking place here in the city of Cape Town for 2023. It's a hive of activity, and myself, as Gugule Tumfupi, have had the opportunity to interact with a large number of leaders and executives here who are part of the Transnet, a state-owned company. And really, we're here to give you some insight and offer you some details into the various divisions of the institution, and most importantly, understanding the role and function that it plays, not only within supporting extractive industries, but really supporting the South African and Southern African economies to thrive. I'm in conversation today at this moment with Fadzai Musoni, who's the General Manager for Growth and Diversification under Transnet Growth and Development. Such a pleasure to have you, Fadzai.
Thank you and good afternoon.
How have you been finding the mining in Indaba so far?
It has started on quite a high. I have to say I'm quite excited. Last year was a little bit slow, but this year's come back with a bang.
A big bang, and we are seeing a lot of companies showing a keen interest in Transnet. So I can imagine that you yourself have been pulled to the side quite often just to answer and address some questions, concerns, and some exciting additions as well to the business.
Oh yes, 100%. I think what we are championing at the moment is most certainly partnering for the growth of the continent, which is something that we are quite excited about. So it's not just about South Africa today, it is about the continent and making sure that we can meet the goals of extractive industries.
Got you, 100%. And that speaks directly to your title here, Fadzai, Growth and Diversification, which is very refreshing because when one thinks of a state-owned entity, you tend to think, oh, it's a laggard in the industry. But you're shaking things up in that regard.
We certainly are. We definitely wear a commercial hat in everything that we're doing. So as much as we are running the ports as well as the rail systems and our pipelines, we are also looking in a commercial sense into the future and what that Transnet looks like. So we are looking most certainly at what we can do with our existing assets, our existing skills, and our existing value propositions, and moving into the continent and moving into areas that we are also quite new at and seeing how we can all collaborate for growth.
So help us understand that for a moment, right? Because so often when we think about the infrastructure that exists, whether from a TFR point of view, how that then speaks to your ports authority, and then TPT being the port terminals, all of this is interlinked. So when you look at the growth and diversification opportunities, help us understand how you ensure that it speaks essentially to all 6 divisions of the entity.
Certainly. So I'll start by maybe just summarizing what we call the Transnet Regional Strategy, which is basically underpinned by building integrated freight systems. And that is something that, as the African Union has come up with the African Free Trade Continental Agreement,
yes,
that is supporting free trade as well as lowering the cost of business in the region. So when we look at Transnet, we look at what role that we play in building these integrated systems in terms of corridors. So the train does not stop at the border of South Africa. It continues into the region. And we're already working together with a lot of our state-owned entities to actually build these corridors. So it's not just about what we're doing locally, it is also about what we're doing in the region. And then when we look at the maritime side, it's also about maritime corridors and what we can do to leverage the different port systems within the country. So you can imagine there's a lot of commodities going in and out, and particularly from the extractive industry perspective, we have to lower the cost of export. So we start to look at how we can all work together to basically lower the costs for the extractive industries as well.
Let's talk about both those aspects, and maybe starting more with our borders, right? You mentioned AFCA, and that's a huge step in the right direction for the continent, really, to bolster interregional trade. Tell us more about the opportunities that exist north of our borders in South Africa.
So one of the biggest ones is obviously rail. So of course the rail continues on, and I think if we see the history of rail, there was always the dream of Cape to Cairo. That was actually not a road, it was a rail system. And so from our perspective, we look at all the continuous corridors going all the way up to the DRC. So we have specifically an initiative at the moment on the north-south corridor that links basically 7 countries from the DRC into Zambia, into Zimbabwe, Botswana, and then into South Africa.
And that's important, right? Because all those
Correct.
countries have something in common.
100%.
Mining. Yeah.
So we are trying to basically make sure that we have a more efficient corridor, getting basically not only just the core ore out of the mines, but also the supplies that are coming in from the various areas going into the different mining projects, whether it's equipment, whether it's reagents or whatever they use in basically their mining operations. So it is a two-way street on the mine, and then basically what we're working on is seeing how we can actually improve efficiencies. But what's also important is not just only about looking at the north-south corridors. It's also looking at the east-west and what can be done there, because essentially it's about lowering the cost of business and also helping with trade corridors becoming more free and fair.
Let's discuss that a little bit more in detail, right? Because you mentioned the DRC coming down to Zambia and into South Africa eventually, but there's also opportunities, as you say, west, Senegal.
Correct.
Unlock that for us, because for some of us in our mind, Senegal is a far, far, far away place that might not match up to the infrastructure needs that Transnet has.
So it is very far if you start thinking about land infrastructure, but when you look at the port systems, particularly in Senegal and the Western Africa, there is a very strong link. And so you start looking at transshipment. So it might be actually, in fact, it is actually cheaper for some of the shipping lines to basically take their cargoes and leave them in West Africa because they're closer to Europe.
Makes sense.
And then that then gets moved from there down south. So you'll actually see that if you look into the sea, there's a lot of different corridors that all link up. Not necessarily on land. And that becomes quite important because it's the same customers that we are servicing in west, east, and on the southern side of the continent.
Paint a picture for us when you talk about corridors. For a lot of us,
Yes.
we tend to work in offices, we stay in landlocked countries or don't
Sure.
have much access to the maritime industry. So when you discuss these corridors, what do they look like? How do they interlink? And what kind of economic value and opportunities can they unlock?
So it's mostly transportation corridors. So you would look at rail links, road links. You'd also look at the sea in terms of different shipping lines and routes. So anything that you can draw a line from one point to the other that needs to get goods in and out of a particular place basically becomes a corridor for us. And if you talk specifically in the mining space, when we're starting to look into the region, the North-South corridor is an important one. The Trans-Kalahari one is very important because you start to look at particular ores that are coming out of the different countries. So the DRC is a good example where we have different mines that are mining copper, cobalt, lithium, related products that need to find a way out of the continent. And so they'll need to follow specific corridors to get to the ports as fast as possible. So they're either going east, west, or south. And in all of those corridors, everybody needs to work together to make it happen.
Got you.
Yes.
I also understand that this is naturally important for Transnet because you do want to be a forward, future-facing company that actually
Correct.
addresses the needs of many of their stakeholders. But I think it's imperative that we do underscore why this is important for the many stakeholders who might be listening and perhaps lack a clearer vision about the role and function of logistics and transport in our economy.
Sure. So I'm going to give you an example. As Transnet, if you look at the rail, our rail business, and you compare it to the rest of the continent, we actually run 80% of the rail infrastructure in the continent.
That's a huge number, Fadzai.
Correct, in the continent.
Yeah.
So that makes us a true leader when it comes to the operations of rail. And therefore, we actually find that the rest of the continent is looking to us in terms of how to do business, in terms of how we operate. At one stage, I would actually be as bold to say Transnet was the largest rail operator in the continent. And so from our perspective, we see that collaborating with the rest of the region becomes quite important in order for us to extend our corridors, because naturally the rail does want to extend outwards. And so there's a benefit to Transnet in the sense that the cargo gets onto our rail systems, but also there's a benefit in the continent because we start to build up some of those rail capabilities throughout the continent, and it helps, as I said, supporting the AU agenda.
Got you. And let's talk about that just a little further. As you mentioned, the Ep2 agreement, again, it's not necessarily very tangible to many South Africans or ordinary households to fully understand the impact and the value that it does bring about. But in partnership with Transnet, working alongside other companies, primarily in the mining space, given where we are today, put it into context for us as to the kind of ROI that we could potentially generate as an economy.
Look, I think for me, the fact that this has come out of the AU agenda, and just the sheer potential of what Africa could look like if we opened up the borders. I think we have the example of Europe and what has happened with the European Union, and that is something that we're trying to follow. So if you look at what happens, and I'm going to give you a very practical example, when you have commodities moving from one country to the other, and there's 2 border posts in every single country. So let's just take the path of copper from the DRC through our port of Durban. It goes through at least 4 or 5 border posts. And there's exchange of drivers, exchange of different, I guess I would say, regulations around the sovereignty of who operates where. Now, if we could just take all of that red tape off, and actually enable trade, which means you could have this train basically turnaround time be reduced dramatically and be able to run a lot more trains and a lot faster, and be able to actually improve your operational efficiency. That alone gives us a massive return in terms of the economy, because we are not having to have our trains taking close to a month to get cargoes from one place to the other. So that for me then starts to look into how do you then create economies around that, and also build onto job creation and the like. And for me, I think if we start just looking at that, that's just an example around the entire continent and what we're able to do, then most certainly we will see that return.
I want us to link this with one of our most important resources as a globe and as a continent being our people, and then a theme that obviously dominates the future being technology. People, technology, the growth markets that you've just discussed at the moment. Help us unpack how these two collide, and I guess how we can extract value from both people, upskilling them to make sure that they can fully capitalize on these growth strategies that Transnet is looking to implement.
Sure. So one of our big value propositions at the moment is Transnet Academy, which is basically set up into different faculties that train different aspects of transport logistics. So from port operations to marine services, pipeline engineering, as well as actual freight rail and rail simulations. And that is one thing for us that has become quite patent, as you've said. There's been a great exodus of skills out of the continent for greener pastures. And what we're trying to do is basically, as Transnet, instead of just going into another country with an opportunity, we are actually putting the people and the skills and the capacity building first, because that is what we're trying to do. So we have no intention of going into a country and staying there as Transnet and running operations on other people's behalves. We have every intention to train, capacitate, and then work together, as I've said, to build a future for our continent. So that is something that we are really driving from a faculty perspective with the different aspects. And a lot of the work that we do, we start there. We start with training, we start with capacity building, and then you're able to leave then a project that can run on its own after that.
100%. Oh, speaks to a lot of investment taking place, not only in the capacity, the people, the networks, the infrastructure. Where to next for you on the African continent? That's a trick question.
It's a trick question. Look, I mean, one of the things that we really do thrive on is looking at the economics of the continent. And obviously, we are still looking at seeing what value that brings to South Africa and to Transnet. So we do take very much a commercial outlook on where we're going. And so the growth rates of the different countries, the ease of doing business, as well as I call it follow the money principle. We are working very closely with the DFIs, namely the DBSA, the ECIC, the IDC, and that whole team, especially looking at where they're also putting in investments, and then we coming in as the technical partners or operating partners. And so far it's been quite successful. So we are everywhere that we believe there's real value, and also that there's a good integration with what we're currently doing as a corporate strategy.
Fantastic. I'm tempted to say Fadzai Mosone, coming to a country near you. On that note, thank you so much for indulging us. I think we've all learned a great deal about the opportunities that exist for Transnet right across the continent. And as you say, unlocking value for the continent, not just for South Africa itself, and adding to the value of her people as well. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Bye.
It's GM for Growth and Diversification at Transnet, giving us some insight into the growth opportunities that exist right across the continent for the group.